I was 30 seconds into the tape when the girl's voice came through the headset, faint, hollow, echoing like it rose from inside the earth. I live here now. The waveform barely crested the baseline, but the hair on my arm stood up, same as it did the first time I heard those words on a battered VHS in a police archive in Denver. If you were alive in '83, you remember the breaking news. If you weren't, you've heard the story in fragments. A child vanished, a pit in the mountains. 4 days no one can fully account for. And a rescue that didn't so much end the story as start a new one. What I didn't expect, 40 years later, was to find an echo still moving through that hole, or to hear my own name, whispered where no air should carry sound. Before you write me off, understand what I am, a man of paper trails and shoe leather, not angels. I've spent 20 years living on diner coffee and courthouse microfilm, chasing hows and whys until they come apart in my hands. People want closure like it's a product you can buy at the end of a video. But cold cases don't close. They sediment. Layers of grief, rumor, paperwork. And every so often, some tremor deep down shakes the strata and old things rise. The tremor hit in July of 2025 when a retired ranger from Chief Hosa called my tip line. His voice was a tangle of cigarettes and apology. He said, "Look, this is probably nothing, but the old latrine near the service road, yeah, that one, something's wrong with it at night." I told him nothing about that place has been right since 1983. He said, "Not like that." He said he went out to smoke where he shouldn't, because men who quit 20 years ago still get lonesome. And he heard a child crying slow, like the sound had to push through syrup to reach him. He called out. The crying stopped, and then a man's voice came up from the hole, and the voice said my first and last name. My phone went warm in my hand. People think fear is a spike. In my line of work, it's a long, steady tone. I asked him if he was messing with me. He swore on a wife that left him in '98 that he wasn't. I asked him to meet me the next night. If you're waiting for me to say I ran heroic into the darkness, sorry to disappoint. I parked at the turnout off I-70, sat in the driver's seat, and watched the sky go violet. July in the foothills smells like hot pine and old wood. When the ranger arrived, Earl, a man whose sunburn never healed, he brought the kind of flashlight that turns night into theater. We didn't turn it on. We just stood there by the wooden shack, wind combing the grass, cicadas sawing the air, while traffic far below hummed like a sleeping animal. The door creaked when Earl opened it. Hinges remember. The smell hit first. If you want clean edges in your memories, do not work cases with bathrooms in them. Earl went still, like he'd stepped on an old habit. He nodded toward the square of black. "Give it a minute," he said. "It doesn't start right away." I'm not ashamed to say my hands shook. I've heard final breaths, interrogations that went off the rails, a mother praying in Spanish over a son who didn't come home. This didn't sound like any of that. At first, it was only the wind down the shaft, except there wasn't any wind. Then the air shifted, as if something below us had just inhaled. I felt it in my chest more than my ears. A thin voice rose, no language at first, just cadence. And then the words, same as they were on the 1983 tape, same pitch, same little curl at the end. "I live here now." The flashlight jumped in Earl's grip. "You hear that?" he whispered. "I heard an old recording in a wooden box," I said. Another voice inside me said, "Liar." We lasted another minute. Then the voice changed timbre. It went older, lower, more air in it, like a 40-year echo talking to itself. It said, "Don't let go." Then, wrapped around that, something else. More breath than word, but exactly in my ear, though my head was 2 feet above a square hole in the floor. The whisper used my name. Not shouted, not booming up the shaft. Near, intimate, like a friend at a wake. "We left. Don't judge." Sometimes courage is knowing when not to feed a thing. In the motel room off Federal Boulevard, I pulled the old case file like a Catholic pulls a rosary, not because it saves you, but because your hands need something to do. I reread the facts I could stand to read again. Summer of '83. A front yard in Sheridan. A car, a lure, a hand. Mountains. A pit. 4 days. A rescue by birdwatchers, whose names I still remember, because gratitude should be particular. There are lines I won't repeat here. Not out of squeamishness, but because the story doesn't belong to me. What I can say is that survival isn't a tidy arc. It corkscrews. It leaves nails in the floor you keep catching your sock on. By morning, I'd talked myself into reasonable explanations. Old wood channels sound. Kids mess around with phones. Earl hears what he expects to hear. The brain is a magician that uses fear as misdirection. I drank coffee that tasted like melted pennies and called a woman I'd promised to call only if it mattered. She answered on the second ring, warm and wry. She told me she was busy, that people who do the work rarely have time to talk about the work, and then she told me to talk. I did, careful with facts like they were glass. There was a long pause. Then, so it's doing it again. Doing what again? Carrying, she said. The earth carries. You know how a conch shell holds the sea? Holes hold time. You poke a wound in ground that old, and it doesn't heal the way we do. It remembers pressure. It releases it in weather, in anniversaries, in people. You don't believe in this, I said, partly a question, partly a plea. I believe that some places are not done speaking, she said, and people go listen. That night I went back alone because of course I did. Not to be brave, but because if you hear your name from a hole that once held a child, you either turn your back on yourself or you answer. I brought a recorder and a rope, not to go down no way, but to show the dark I was willing to meet it halfway. If this were a ghost story, the wind would kill my lantern. If this were a skeptic's takedown, I'd reveal a Bluetooth speaker. It was neither. It was a heat that didn't belong to the air, rising from the square like breath from a sleeping animal. It was a rhythm in the boards under my feet, a slow, patient heartbeat, not mine. Okay, I said, to no one, to the rangers, to the girl from the tape, to the man on the rope who said hold on. I'm here. The first sound was not a voice, it was water. Not sloshing dripping, slow, steady, like stalactites learning to speak. Then metal, a small clink like a car key tapped against a ring. Then, absurdly, wings. I tell you this fully aware how it reads. Wings in a place no bird would go. The recorder's levels barely moved. I held the rope in one hand and my breath in the other, and I waited for the magic trick to reveal its string. None came. What came was a story, told the way Earth tells stories, in repetitions and little changes. I live here now. Pause. Don't let go. Pause. Then different. A new line, one I had not heard on any tape, not in any transcript, not whispered in any archive. Tell her, the hole said, not to a camera, not to an audience, to me. Tell who? I said. The dark answered with drip, clink, breath. If you're looking for the neatness of a hero's journey, you won't find it here. What you will find is a man who went to a place where time remembered him, which should be impossible. You will find a voice that had learned a new sentence after 40 years, which should be a trick. You will find an old case that the paperwork said had ended, but the ground insisted had not. So I did what men like me do. I followed the voice up the mountain and back into 1983, and then forward into the heat of 2025, where the air above that square hung heavy and the past breathed like a living thing. And I started to tell her. Earl wouldn't go back a third time, so I went alone with a firmness and a promise I didn't know how to keep. The promise was to the voice. and to the girl who had once said she lived here now, and to the man I used to be before cases like this rearranged my furniture inside. Triple H wasn't a framework to me out there. It was a reflex. Heighten, a new sentence that shouldn't exist. Hold. Don't flinch when the past leans close. I set the recorder on the lip, tied the safety line around my waist, just to feel tethered to something, and clicked on a small lantern, aiming it away from the shaft, as if light might insult whatever lived in the dark. The first minutes were ordinary in the way only fear can make them ordinary. Insects, my breath, distant highway. Then the air cooled against my forearms, like a basement door opening. The drip started. Tea. Hen the clink. Then this is the part that would make any rational man reach for irrational story footsteps. Not above. Not below. Exactly where my feet were, one beat out of sync with mine. I pressed my hand flat to the board. The board was still. The steps continued. Tell her what? I asked, as if the whole followed conversational rules. The drip paused, the way a listener does. Tell her she didn't leave anything down there, I said. Tell her she got out. Wind moved in the trees, but not in the shack. Tell her, the voice said again, closer this time, gentler, like it was practicing kindness. Then it gave me a second gift. You kept the shoes. Long story short, I had, not these shoes. The shoes from another case, another summer. A different child found in a different place that made sense, only if you pretended the world was fair. I'd kept them too long as evidence, then too long as a talisman, then too long out of guilt. Nobody but me knew that. Nobody ever should. I'm listening, I said. My voice was smaller than I wanted it to be. By morning, I had what I thought I'd wanted. An anomaly that refused the easy bins prank. Echo, suggestion plus a note in my pocket from a motel clerk who'd recognized me from a podcast with a smaller audience than my self-importance. My aunt babysat her once, a note said, with a number I could call if I didn't mind waking a woman who traded Colorado winters for Arizona dryness. I called. She told me about a little girl who climbed onto countertops and declared herself the queen of the kitchen, who liked oranges, who once tried to mail a pinnacone to Mountain. She told me the girl's mother kept her hair neat even when everything else frayed. She told me none of that belonged to the whole, which sounded less like denial than boundary setting. Then she apologized for crying and said the only thing she wanted, after all these years, was for someone to say that place had no more of the little girl's life left in it. That afternoon, I drove out to the service road with an idea that would either prove I'd lost the plot or show me a plot I hadn't seen. I'd brought a geophone on loan from a friend in oil and gas who owed me for not publishing a story about an accident he barely walked away from. A geophone listens to the ground. The ground has more to say than most people, if you give it a good ear. I placed the sensor on the dirt just outside the shack and watched the little screen scratch its pencil marks across time. Normal noise looks like rain on a windshield. What I saw looked like handwriting. Not letters, don't get carried away, but patterns that repeated, and nearly repeated, then repeated again with one change. The kind of change people make when they're learning. I recorded 30 minutes, then another 30 after sundown. The second run held the same arcs, the same peaks, plus a cluster of pulses timed almost exactly to my heart rate, except mine had slowed with practice breathing, while the pulses stayed fast and childlike. I could have explained all of it if one detail hadn't ruined my comfort. At the 31-minute mark, the pulses grouped into 3, paused, grouped into 4, paused, grouped into 3 again. 3-4-3. Not numerology. A pattern I knew by feel. The start of a phone number I had dialed every week for 10 years, then not at all for 3 after the person on the other end asked me to stop calling. The number belonged to the woman whose voice I had heard before I ever met her, the one who taught people how to speak their hurt into something useful, the one I was afraid to ask for help because men like me prefer solitary bricks to houses with lights in them. I called anyway. She didn't say hello, just, I was wondering when you'd let me be mad at you. Be mad later, I said. I need your ear. We met at the turnout where summer traffic whips excuses through your hair. She looked like a woman who had made peace with being both a lighthouse and a storm. I told her the whole thing, the geophone, the patterns, the new sentence in the dark. She walked around the shack with her head tilted the way people listen for bats. This is not a haunting, she said finally. This is a pressure release. Of what? Memory, she said. We want memory to be a brain thing. It's a place thing too. That hole was a mouth once. It learned a sentence, and it's still practicing. You're making poetry out of a bad speaker and the world's most suggestible man. Maybe, she said. But you came back. That makes you the audience it's practicing for. We argued like people who used to be tender with each other and were trying not to remember how. Then she took a small, bright object from her bag, a brass thurible from the church sale, repurposed. She filled it with dried sage and frankincense because she liked how the smoke wrote the air, not because she believed smoke changed the world. We're going to give the place a new sentence, she said. Something it can practice that isn't stuck. In the dark, we stood shoulder to shoulder over the square, our shoulders not touching because history is stubborn. She spoke first, not in ritual voice, but in the same tone you use with a scared dog. You live here now, she said, gently correcting herself. No, you lived here then? You live somewhere else now. I said it too, feeling ridiculous, and also, somehow, exact. The whole breathed. That's the only word for it. It drew the smoke down and let it drift back with a sweetness that did not belong to that place. Then the voice came. Not the girl's. A man's thin with distance, but not hateful. Tired. I never let go, it said, and for a moment I almost pitied a kind of man I'd promised myself I would never pity. Almost. The rope at my waist went tight as if a hand had taken hold. The woman beside me didn't step away. You can let go, she said, not to him, to me. There are 100 reasons the line could have gone taut. Air currents, my own shifting weight, thermal expansion. There is only one reason that made my knees dip, the whisper in my ear that followed. Tell her I didn't take the voice, it said. It stayed. I have to be careful here. This is not a confession from beyond. This is not absolution offered by a void. This is a sentence the place learned, or a sentence I needed the place to learn for me, but it was new. And newness has gravity. The rope slackened, the air warmed. The drip clocked 2 ticks faster, and then settled into a slower cadence, like a metronome turned from allegro to andante. On the drive back, I thought about the way survivors talk. The words they use are often small and accurate. They avoid fireworks. They don't forgive on camera, because forgiveness isn't a trick. It's a room you have to live in. The woman in my passenger seat watched the interstate curve like a long question. You're going to tell her, she said. Not a question, a boundary. And an ask. I don't have the right. You have the tape, she said. You have the ground. You have the wrong shoes in your closet. You have the voice saying tell her. Rights are for courts. This is courtesy. That night, sleep came on like a coward and left even quicker. In the thin hour I dreamed, the square was an eye that blinked slow as weather. In the morning, I wrote a letter I didn't send. Then I wrote a second one I also didn't send. Then I did the only productive thing I could think to do. I called the bird watchers. They were older now, voices like warm wood, but their memory of that day had a sharpness that time hadn't sanded down. They argued, as old couples do, about who had seen the movement first, who had gone for help, who had reached down with their belt and said, hold on. Don't let go, the man said, and the words didn't echo. They settled. Do you ever go back? I asked. Once, he said. anniversary we didn't tell anyone about. We sang a song we never sang in church. We said thank you to the mud. Did the place sound different? I asked. He laughed. Son, places always sound different once you've learned to listen. After we hung up, I drove to a house in a quiet neighborhood that had learned how to be both private and brave. The woman who opened the door looked like someone who had met every version of her own story and chosen the one that let her go on. I told her why I'd come without selling the mystery like a carnival trick. I told her about the voice that learned new words and the way the air down there held a kind of heat only certain days could carry. I told her that I had no interest in pulling her back into that square. She smiled, not unkindly. Places keep practicing, she said. So do we. I don't think it took your voice, I said, before my courage fled. I think it borrowed a sentence. She nodded like she'd known that longer than I had. Will you go with me? She asked. To the shack? To where it ends this time, she said. Not for the camera. For the ground. We made a plan that involved no one's approval but our own. We drove up at sundown. Two people who had both, in their own ways, refused to let go for too long. We said nothing on the path. You don't talk on the way to a wound. You listen for the weather inside it? At the shack, she didn't hesitate. She stepped in and stood over the square and closed her eyes and breathed the way people breathe when they've carried a sentence for 40 years and are ready to put it down. The drip kept time. The clink agreed. The air rose warm. I lived here then, she said, patient with the place like you are with a dog that still flinches when you lift your hand. I don't live here now, the whole answered, not with a word, but with a change in silence. It was as if the boards exhaled. The weight that isn't weight left the rope around my waist. In my ear, near as breath, the whisper came again, but softer, and this time it didn't use my name. Tell her she doesn't owe me, it said. Then it was only water, only night, only two people and a square that had learned, finally, a new way to be empty. On the way back to the cars, she told me about a child who once listened to crickets through a drinking glass pressed to the grass, how it made the earth sound like a radio between stations. She said sometimes our bodies are just glasses we press to the ground. She said sometimes we pick up other people's stations by mistake. Return to sender, she said, and laughed for the first time all week. It followed me home, not as a voice in the room, no rattling dishes, no cold spots, but as a rhythm in the plumbing, a patient tap-tap pause that matched the drip and the clink I'd learned on the mountain. You spend enough nights with a sound, and it becomes a roommate. I stood in my kitchen at 2 a.m., hand on the sink, feeling for coincidence, like a doctor feels for a pulse. Tap-tap, pause, tap. I laughed at myself and turned the faucet just to give the night something ordinary to chew on. The pipes sang like old brass, and the rhythm vanished as if the house had cleared its throat and remembered how to be a house. I slept on the couch to keep an eye on the wrong problem. In dreams, the square blinked again, slow and patient, and the voice said the sentence it had learned in 100 variations, sometimes like a child, sometimes like a man leaning on the wrong doorbell. Tell her, when I woke, the city had gone gray, the color of sidewalks after sprinklers. I made coffee too strong and called Earl to tell him I'd bring him breakfast at the station. He said don't bother. He was driving to the high country where cell service goes to sleep like a dog in the shade. Some places, he said, you've got to let them talk without you. I told him I understood. I didn't. The anomaly behaved itself until noon, when my phone began vibrating with a number I hadn't seen since boxes arrived on porches in plain brown paper. A videographer I'd used back when I still thought I needed to prove the world to people who'd already decided what it was. Did you send a crew up there? He asked without preface. I told him I didn't have crews anymore. Huh, he said, because somebody's gotten the same sound at a site 30 miles away. He texted me a clip. Wind, birds. Then the cadence, drip, clink, 3-4-3. Not from a shaft. From a culvert under a service road where meltwater whispers when the mountains are sweating. I drove like a man trying to catch up to his own mistake. The culvert sat in a dip where wildflowers came to drink. I crouched at the mouth, already rehearsing the speech I'd give myself about pattern matching and biases. The air was cool and smelled like coin metal. The sound came easy, as if the earth were teaching itself a language phonetically. Drip, vowel, clink, consonant, pause, breath. A ranger I didn't know stepped out from the green with the calm of someone who sees a lot of amateur urgency. "You the guy?" she asked. I said sometimes. She introduced herself as Pike, like the fish, and said she'd put out a notice for kids not to crawl in there because the last thing they needed was a YouTuber stuck in the mouth of the mountain. But I thought you might want to listen with your name on it. We lay on our stomachs at the culvert mouth, grown adults with grass on our elbows, listening to a pipe as if it were a funeral speaker. "Hear it?" she asked. I nodded. "What is it?" she asked, and because I respected her too much to sell her a trick, I said, "A sentence practicing how to be different." She didn't laugh, just pulled a laminated map from her pack and traced a line from the old latrine site to this drainage. "Same watershed," she said. If sound learned to ride water, it could travel. I wanted to kiss her for giving me a physics that let my heart rest. "Doesn't explain the names," she added, dry as sagebrush. Or why last night the echo said, "Don't let go," to a college kid who never heard the phrase before and now won't stop shaking. We found the kid sitting on a boulder like remorse. He was sweet and scared and full of the kind of certainty our bodies produce when they're offended by the world. He told us he'd crawled 2 yards into the pipe for a dare and heard someone behind him say, "Hold on." He backed out and no one was there. Then the same words came again, but inside his head, he said, like when you read silently and still hear the rhythm your third-grade teacher gave you. Pike handled him with the kind of kindness that has edges. No more dares and drains. Friend, and sent him home with a granola bar and a story he would tell different ways for the rest of his life. I recorded 10 minutes of culvert, then 10 minutes of silence to compare, then another 10 with my hand on the concrete to feel the cheap miracle of matter conducting memory. The geophone traced rain writing across the screen, and then handwriting again, and then a shape so familiar, I said it aloud before I could stop myself. Number. 3 pulses. 4. 3. Then a pause long enough to hold a breath and decide not to. I called her the woman with the lighthouse voice and told her the watershed theory. "So the sentence is migrating," she said. "Like geese or grief." I told her about the college kid. She said, "People overhear old prayers in new rooms all the time." I told her that sounded like poetry. "I've got to use something," she said. "Science is busy." That evening, I tried to outpace the pattern by leaving town, as if Denver had suddenly become a board game where the safe squares had been taken and the rest were snakes. I drove east into flat country, where the sky goes on until even your worries get embarrassed. I stopped at a diner in Byers, where the coffee is the color of apologies and the pies are triangular promises. In the bathroom, the sink tapped. Tap, tap. Pause. Tap. "Very funny," I told the universe. A man at the urinal said, "Happens when the swamp cooler kicks in," and the universe forgave me for my dramatics by letting me laugh into my sleeve. Still, when I washed my hands, the rhythm changed. 3-4-3. I dried off too hard and left a paper towel stuck to my palm like a white flag. Back in the booth, a waitress with a name tag that said Mel poured me a second cup without asking and said, "You look like you're arguing with a hymn." I said I might be. She said she'd put the pie on the house if I let her win. "The hymn?" I asked. "The argument," she said. Somewhere around midnight, the road reminded me that the only way out is usually through. I turned west again. The city rose like a lit circuit board. My apartment welcomed me with the smell of paper and rain, two of the most forgiving smells human beings invented. The sink kept its peace. The fridge hummed a secular song. I sat at the kitchen table and laid out every artifact of the week as if I were about to perform a card trick. Recorder, notepad, the brass thurible the woman had pressed into my hand like a favor owed to neither of us. A coil of rope, Earl's flashlight, the geophone's gritty little brain. In the hush, I heard it again. Not the tap, but the other thing. The wing beat from the first night at the shack. 1, then 2. Soft, close. I did what any reasonable man does at 1 a.m. when the air learns new moves. I talked to it. Not out loud, not at first. In the head voice we use on long drives and short bridges. I said, tell her. I said, but what? And the answer came not words this time, but an image that wasn't mine. A bird's eye view, floating above the foothills, as if my soul had rented a small drone. The shack, the culvert, a dry arroyo farther south, my feet hadn't found yet, all connected by a faint thread like a vein under skin. The thread glowed in 343, pulsing toward the city, skirting the river, slipping into a brick building I knew from a life I used to pretend I didn't miss. The radio station where I'd once said true things into a microphone and tried not to cry while strangers told me about their sons. The thread went inside, coiled around a dusty reel-to-reel labeled 1983 archive, then flickered like a lighthouse. Hook, heighten, hold. I slept because my body demanded rent. In the morning, I went to the station with a box of donuts and the smile of a man about to ask for a favor that will cost more than pastries cover. The receptionist had hair like a sunrise and a key fob that opened doors heavy with the smell of old sound. The archive room lived in the basement, as all good secret rooms do. Rows of tapes, dust in the sun like the first snowfall on a bad year. I found the reel with the spidery handwriting and a label that was almost a dare. I threaded it into a machine that looked like it could play a war. The first voice on it was mine from a decade ago, young enough to think empathy and performance were not cousins. I fast-forwarded until the tape sang a little and the machine complained. The next voice was a child's, hollow and grave. I live here now. I had to sit down to keep from standing up too fast and becoming a man-shaped cautionary tale. 2 minutes later, after the questions that never sit right in your mouth, came something I had never heard, not in any clip, not in any version the public knows. A gap, then a sharp intake on the tape like the machine itself remembered to breathe. And then, under the child, rated so low you could miss it if you wanted to, the man's voice. Don't let go. Not a command. A plea. And then this was new another voice barely there. Almost not sound at all. More like a heat signature of a syllable. A woman's, maybe. Or a future's. A single word that might have been now. If you're waiting for me to tell you, I cracked the case. That's not the road we're on. This wasn't a whodunit. It was a where is it now? And right then the answer was, in the tape, in the culvert, in the latrine, in the pipes, in my kitchen, in the part of my chest that keeps a tempo whether I approve or not. The sentence had stopped being an artifact and started being a traveler, and travelers don't stop at borders. They stop where someone is willing to listen. I took the reel outside to copy it in the kind of light that keeps men honest. The station's backlot smelled like hot tar and old cigarettes, the perfume of American radio. The woman with the lighthouse voice met me there because I'd texted her a single word. Now, she cupped one headphone and closed her eyes and listened the way great listeners do, with her whole face. When the barely voice arrived, she flinched in a way you only see when a truth brushes a scar, not to hurt it, but to say hello. You're going to have to decide, she said, pulling the headphones down to her neck. Are you making an episode, or are you making a promise? Can't it be both? It can, she said, but not at the same volume. On the drive home, I passed a church marquee that said, "Forgiveness is not amnesia," in black letters. You could rearrange into other sermons if given half a minute and a step stool. I thought about calls I didn't return and closets I didn't clean and a pair of small shoes I kept because some part of me wanted to feel the weight of failure in my hands without asking anyone to share it. The sink at home tapped twice and then decided against a third. Growth, I thought, and laughed at myself again. That night, the thread found me in sleep. It tugged like a child, asking to be lifted to see fireworks. It pulled me not up the mountain this time, but sideways, toward the river that divides in order to reunite, toward a concrete storm drain, painted with teenagers' attempts at immortality. I woke with a taste of iron in my mouth, and a certainty that if I didn't go, the sentence would keep practicing without me until it learned to say my absence out loud. I grabbed the rope and the recorder and the thurible, because habits make rituals and rituals make courage, and I drove under a sky so clear it made promises I had no right to ask it to keep. At the mouth of the drain, I found company, chalk marks drawn by hands that wanted to be helpful, circles and arrows like a football play made by kids who still believed adults knew what to do. The air slipped out cool and smelled like the inside of a penny jar. I set the recorder on concrete, lit the thurible not for magic, but for breath, and said the sentence we'd taught the mountain. I lived here then. I don't live here now. The echo came back with a small mercy, laughter, not mocking. Delighted, like a child hearing its own voice for the first time in a tube. Then, not a word but a weight, pressing my shoulder, the feeling of a hand, you know. I turned, and no one was there. Still the pressure stayed. It moved lower, to the rope at my waist, then lower still, to my hand. Hold on, it didn't say. Let go, it didn't say either. It let me decide. I tied the rope to a rusted rung and fed it into the dark, as if I were giving the night a leash. The drip started. The clink agreed. The 3-4-3 pulsed once, twice, then fell into a new pattern I couldn't map to anything I knew. Not a number. A rhythm I felt in my ribs and nowhere else. It took me a full minute to realize what it was. Not heartbeat. Not mine. Footsteps on old wood, one beat out of sync with my own. The shack, traveling inside a pipe under the city, inside a man on the riverbank, inside a story that had learned, finally, to move. There's a point in any investigation where you realize the thing you're tracing has started tracing you back. That night at the storm drain, with the rope humming a patient note and the rhythm in my ribs shifting from 3-4-3 into something like breath, I understood I wasn't chasing a culprit. I was accompanying a sentence on its way to becoming a life. You can call that sentimentality. I'd call it field notes. The footsteps in wood rhythm traveled up through the concrete until my knees felt like a floor in an old house that remembers every dance. I crouched, palm on the lip, and waited for the theater trick someone in the pipe. A prank. An animal with impeccable timing. The drain gave me only the faithful sounds of water and minerals and time. Then, tucked inside that, a soft feathering like pages turned by a careful hand, the same almost wings I'd heard in the shack. Not bats, not birds. The sound a tape makes when it skims against a head and learns to sing. The city above us went on with its chores. Somewhere a train complained. Somewhere a couple fought about nothing as a way of not touching something. I fed the rope another foot, not to go down, but to tell the dark. I am not abandoning you to yourself. The recorder's levels moved the way a chest does when someone decides to keep living. Then the voice, thin with distance and softened by years, came through not as a jump scare, but as a courtesy. Tell her, it said. The same request, but without the demand. Like a traveler knocking at a door and waiting to see if the porch light was for him. I will, I said. But you've got to help me say it right. When the pressure lifted from my shoulder, I stood and followed the thread the dream had given me. To the radio station, to the tape, to the space where sound keeps its own calendar. I don't believe in fate, but I believe some corridors are more likely than others. In the basement, the reel-to-reel purr was a cat at a window. The old audio room smelled like warm dust and promises not kept. I threaded the 1983 tape again and let it play from the moment the rescuer's boots rung like bells on the ladder. The child's voice did what it always does to me, buckled my soft parts, and then taught them how not to break. I live here now, she said, and the intake. Then the layered line under her brave tempo, the part the public never heard, the part the ground had been practicing. Don't let go. And the barely there now, like a breath deciding to become a word. She met me outside, the woman whose voice had saved more men than they will ever admit. I told her about the storm drain, about the way the sentence moves like water knows where it's going, about the pattern changing in my chest. She touched my sternum with 2 fingers, like a tuning fork. You're carrying some of it, she said. That's not noble. That's heavy. Be careful you don't romanticize being a bucket when what's needed is a river. I have always loved and resented how she can compliment and warn in the same breath. Help me do it right, I said. We will, she said, making me sound like the smallest and largest boat at once. The plan we made would sound absurd to anyone who hasn't sat with sorrow until it starts making practical requests. We would ask the sentence to practice somewhere new one last time, and then we would ask it to rest. Not to erase it history, that's erased finds new rooms, but to release the obligation to repeat. The place would be chosen not for spectacle or secrecy, but for kindness, a clean, bright, human room where we set the conditions. The old pediatric ward had a consultation room with windows like forgiveness, and a view of the courtyard where volunteers once blew bubbles for kids whose lungs needed a picture of how to float. The hospital let us in after hours, because she had keys made of trust and reputation. We brought the reel. We brought the geophone. We brought nothing we couldn't carry out in one trip if the air grew mean. The first playthrough was mercy, the second medicine. On the third, we spoke with it, not at it, with it. You lived there then, she said. You live somewhere else now. I said it too, so the room could learn our chorus. The geophone traced rain, then handwriting, then the shape of the number, trying again like a child doing sums. That's all right, she told the room. You don't have to say that anymore. On the tape, the rescuer's belts creaked. A man said, hold on. Under it, the barely voice pressed the same single syllable it had pressed in the basement. Now, but longer. Now, as if the past itself was stretching. The air changed the way rooms change, right before a storm or a first kiss. The smell of hot dust vanished, replaced by something like clean linen and oranges. I glanced at her. She was crying in the way professionals allow themselves to cry, quietly, briefly, like rain a good roof can handle. If it asks you to hold on, she said, tell it you're here. Not holding, here. I put my hand on the old tape machine, the way you put your hand on a friend's shoulder when you don't have advice worth a dime. We're here, I said. The machine didn't answer. The room did. The geophone slowed its little heartbeat, the lines widening into a landscape that felt walkable. The reel turned. The child's voice made its brave assertion. Then the man's plea came, softened so far down into the bedrock it nearly wasn't a plea anymore. And then the new thing. The child's line returned, but altered by the room that had learned a new sentence. I lived there then, the tape said. Not a dub, not a splice. We had no tech for that here. An artifact of a place learning to speak with you. If you think I'm telling you that a tape changed its words, you're missing the point, and also probably correct in your skepticism. The tape was the same. The listening changed. The room changed. We changed. But it felt like the sentence itself had agreed to move its furniture. We sat with the quiet after, as if it were a guest who might say one more thing if we didn't make it feel rushed. In that quiet, she reached for my hand and didn't stop halfway this time. "If you're going to tell her," she said, "tell her like this. Not on a stage, not in a studio. In a room with windows where the air remembers how to be kind. I did what I'd been avoiding. I asked for permission instead of forgiveness. The woman whose story had been everyone's since 1983 met me at a small community space with good chairs and bad coffee. She looked like a person who had learned to be a verb. We sat, I said. The ground learned a sentence and practiced it until other places could say it too. I said, I don't think that place kept your voice. I think it borrowed one line, and it's time we told it it's done. I told her the line it had waited for me on the riverbank to deliver. I told her the new room's answer. She closed her eyes. People think that's about shutting things out. It's more often about letting the right things in. I have always hated that hole, she said, and I have always hated how it keeps being the middle of my story, no matter how far I walk. If you can help it learn a different job, do it. If you can't, don't pretend you can for a neat ending. No neat endings, I said. Just honest ones. We picked a day when the city felt like a song that knows its own lyrics. We drove up at dusk, the time when light is serious and coy. Earl met us there because he changed his mind the way men do when they discover a soft spot they didn't know they were allowed to keep. Pike came too, maps and lamination at the ready. The birdwatchers didn't need to be asked. They arrived with sandwiches and the kind of patience that fixes more than it breaks. The college kid sent us a text that said I'm in class, but I'm thinking yes. The radio station lent us the reel as if lending a relic to a small procession. We didn't make a circle. We didn't hold hands. We didn't pray unless you count breathing together until the room found our tempo. She stepped to the square, as she does, not to perform but to be. I lived here then, she said, one last time as instruction. I don't live here now. The whole breathed, and for the first time since 1983, it sounded like a sigh that wasn't asking anyone to do anything. The drip settled into something you could sleep near. The clink grew so faint you could imagine it was memory shedding its keys. The man's voice rose like a fish under dark water, and then didn't break the surface. It hovered. It considered. He said nothing we could call a confession, nothing we could use in a court, nothing that would satisfy anyone hungry for an arrow. He said a single word that wasn't an apology, and wasn't a demand, and wasn't a command either. He said, enough, not to her, to himself. Then he let go, which is a sentence you never get to hear in past tense unless you're very lucky or very late. On the drive down, the radio found a station without static and played a song that had been overused in movies about redemption and still worked on me. At a stoplight, she laughed, not because anything was funny, but because laughter sometimes arrives when wounds are freshly painted inside you. You're going to keep listening, she said. You're going to check the sink and the drains and the reels until you decide you don't have to. She wasn't wrong. I am a man who checks. But that night when I got home and turned the faucet on, it just ran. Water doing what water does, a blessing we only notice when it stops. Sleep came like a decent landlord. In the morning, I walked into the kitchen and waited. The pipes were quiet. No tap-tap. No 3-4-3. The silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like a hand taken off a shoulder exactly when the body underneath had remembered how to stand. We weren't done. Places continue. People do, too. The watershed still moved. The culvert still whispered. The storm drain still offered acoustics to teenagers rehearsing their own lines. But the sentence's job had changed. It had been a call. Now it was a story. And stories don't trap you if they're told right. They guide you to the door and say, if you need to come back, you'll know the way. If you don't, go on. 2 days after the mountain exhaled, the shoes found me. Not in a dream, not by poltergeist, by cardboard. A box waited on my doorstep like a dare. Inside, wrapped in old newspaper that made my fingers black with headlines, were the tiny sneakers I'd kept too long from another summer. Another case I never learned to hold without breaking something in my hands. No note. Just wait. Memory doesn't knock. It lets itself in. I set them on the table like contraband and poured coffee I didn't need. The apartment was the quiet of a place that's been forgiven for being a place. Pipes didn't tap. The fridge hummed a practical psalm. But under the everyday noise, the sentence had learned a softer job. Not a call. A suggestion. When I touched the fraying laces, the old reflex came a montage of what-ifs, police tape, a mother's eyes like cracked glass, and then, uninvited, the new line. I lived there then. I don't live there now. The room offered it to me as if to say, practice, fool. I called the woman with the lighthouse voice and told her about the box. She didn't ask who sent it, because the who didn't matter as much as the what now. You already know, she said. You're going to take them where they don't have to keep being relics. Where is that? Where they can be something else first, she said. A gift, a story, a small praise. I carried the shoes the way you carry a sleeping child, careful, a little unsteady, aware of tenderness's weight. The place that made sense was a community center on Federal with scuffed floors and a bulletin board, announcing free grief groups and a potluck that was always casserole heavy because grandmothers know logistics better than grief. In a room with good light and bad coffee, I put the shoes on a table and told their story to an audience that didn't need names or timelines to feel the gravity. I didn't sanctify them. I didn't indict anyone. I said, these kept me from letting go. Today, I'm letting go a different way. A grandfather raised his hand the way boys do in classrooms. He said he didn't believe in ghosts, but did believe in echoes. A woman in a Bronco sweatshirt said sometimes we keep objects as punishment, like we're asking them to bruise us on schedule so the world won't sneak up with a fresh hit. The group leader, a woman with a silver braid like a line on a map, said, objects are not altars unless we make them. Then she asked the question I knew was coming and still wasn't ready for. What do you want them to be next? No one ever asks the obvious out loud. That's why it works. I said, small, useful, not heavy. The leader nodded. Then we'll reassign them. We wrote a note on a single index card, the kind teachers use for words worth keeping. The card said, for feet that will run toward a future. The shoes went into a donation bin that had seen its share of hard stories, but still believed in fresh starts. In my chest, something unknotted, not all the way. Knots are proud like that. Enough. On the way out, the bulletin board caught me with a flyer for a neighborhood radio night in a church basement. Bring your tapes, your stories, your broken recordings, and because the universe has a sense of humor, the featured activity was a reel-to-reel demonstration. You coming? The silver braid asked, catching me reading. We don't have good snacks, she warned, but we have good listening. I went because I'm a man who checks. The basement smelled like coffee and crayons, the shared scent of every honest room. Folding chairs faced a table with a machine that could play wars and weddings. A retired engineer with hands like careful wrenches explained heads and bias and the way tape carries ghosts that are really physics. We fed the 1983 reel for the people who'd come, not to gawk, but to witness. The child's voice filled the cinder block with a bravery that could shame armies. I live here now, she said. The breath on the tape inhaled. The old man's voice braided under. Don't let go. And then that now, like a hinge. A teenager with purple hair raised a hand. Is that real? She asked, meaning the braid of voices, the physics of grief. The engineer said, as real as sound, which is to say, it moves you, and that's the fact. A woman in the back whispered that she remembered the news in '83, remembered the way the whole city held its breath. I was pregnant, she said. I remember not letting go of anything for a month. The room nodded. You can hear nods when a room has learned the trick. After the demo, the engineer called me over with a frown that wasn't unkind. He showed me the leader on the tape, beginning to shed dust like snow. You're wearing it out, he said. Play it again. It'll give you a gift you don't want. I almost joked about hauntings. He wasn't joking. Archival is care, he said. You want the story to live? You can't keep scraping it to the bone. So we made a copy, clean as we could manage. And that's when the room did the thing rooms sometimes do when time gets interested. While we ran the transfer, an additional sound rode the line that shouldn't have been there, no. Not a spirit, not a whisper from under the floorboards. A voice recorded on the new copy that the old reel did not contain. The waveform bulged where it shouldn't. The engineer swore softly, then more softly, like a man minding his language in front of a baby. He rolled back. We listened. After the child and after the man came a voice we all recognized, even if we'd never met it. The particular cadence of someone who grew a voice in the same room as her own story. It wasn't a full sentence, not even a word. It was breath-shaped like speech, the beginning of a syllable that carried a promise inside it. You know how a now becomes a now? It had that shape. The engineer stopped the transfer, hands hovering like he'd touched a stove. That's not possible, he said, which is a phrase that has haunted and nourished every decent investigation since we started knocking rocks together for warmth. We played it again. Same place, same impossible exhale. A few degrees more voiced than on the basement reel. The retired engineer looked at me like I'd smuggled a trick in my pocket. The silver braid smiled at him like he was a beloved uncle being a little too certain. Sometimes rooms hold rehearsals, she said. Sometimes the mic catches the sound of courage clearing its throat. I took the copy home in a padded envelope carried like an egg. In my kitchen, the quiet had ripened into something gentle. When I put on headphones, I expected either nothing or everything. What I got was smaller and therefore larger. A new breath living in the space where the tape had been rehearsing a word. A breath I'd heard in real rooms, not basements. A breath right before a person you love says the thing they've been working up to for years. Not a confession, not a curse, but a boundary you can live alongside. I took the headphones off and let the silence finish its sentence. The question arrived as it always does. Do you put this in the world? Men in my business dress the question up. We call it editorial judgment, ethics, responsibility. Underneath the suit, it's simple. Is this yours to say? Or is your job to carry it where it belongs and stop? I drove without calling ahead. The community space was open because people have learned that doorways are a kind of medicine. She met me with that particular smile survivors earn the hard way, the one that says I will allow this, but only because I choose to. I asked her if she wanted to hear the copy. No, she said gently. I want you to tell me what you heard. And then I want you to decide if telling anyone else helps anyone breathe. So I told her. The breath, the almost word. The way the machine and the room and the people were learning their jobs anew. She listened with her whole face, then looked out the window at the courtyard where someone had strung cafe lights like commas. I don't need to hear it, she said. I am it. Then she gave me the line I'd been avoiding. Don't make me content. Make me a neighbor. The lighthouse voice woman joined us with a paper bag that turned out to be oranges and a joke about how symbolism is for people who can afford metaphor. We laughed, then ate oranges in a room where grief had started to smell like citrus and new paint. The three of us sat with no microphones. It felt like a better recording than any I'd ever made. After, the engineer texted a photo of the reel-to-reel with a sticky note on it in someone else's hand. ENOUGH. I didn't ask who wrote it. Some rooms answer only if you let the mystery do its job, which isn't to spook you. It's to keep you from believing you got the whole of it in one sitting. That night, the sink ran like a river, forgiving a man for being a man. I slept without appointment. I dreamed of belts and ladders and hands that don't let go until the exact second they should. When I woke, there was a voicemail. Not from a hole, not from a machine. From Pike, voice steady as laminated maps. "You should come up," she said. "Not because it's starting again. Because it's quiet in the right way. People should get to hear what that sounds like at least once." Pike was right. The mountain was quiet in the right way. Like a house after a long illness, when the radiator finally remembers how to hum without clanking. We stood outside the wooden shack at sundown and listened to nothing, which turned out to be its own kind of music. The drip was there, but as weather, not as word. The little metal clink had become a suggestion too shy to interrupt. The square in the floor looked like what it was. A hole, not a mouth, not an altar. If you've never felt relief arrive without fanfare, it's easy to miss, like noticing your jaw isn't clenched and realizing you've been chewing thunder for years. Girl took off his cap and said he didn't have a speech. Pike handed me a laminated sheet that said "Site closed for healing" in block letters, half a joke, half a boundary. Birdwatchers arrived with sandwiches cut diagonally, which is how you know love did some of the slicing. We didn't gather in a circle and chant. We didn't assign roles. We breathed, let the place find our tempo, and waited for the now familiar pull on the rope that didn't come. That was the miracle. Not voices. Absence. A sentence had learned a new job, and then with dignity clocked out. There was one more place to check, and the ground insisted on a last test, the way a patient squeezes your hand to prove the anesthesia has worn off. A culvert under the service road whispered meltwater and frogs, summer's gossip. I lay on my stomach with my ear to the concrete and heard the rhythm that had once chased me across a city. Tap, tap, pause, tap. But it was only water now trying out its consonants. I waited for 343 and got birdsong. A teenage boy and girl walked past holding hands with the careful bravery of people training a new animal. Pike gave them a ranger's nod and let them be young. "I'm not going to air it," I said, not to anyone in particular, but to the air which had earned the right to register votes. The impossible copy, the breath where there hadn't been sat in a padded envelope in my glove compartment like an egg. I had no intention of hatching for an audience. I'm not going to make it a trick or a thumb in anyone's algorithm. The decision didn't feel noble. It felt like not making a mess in someone else's kitchen. Back in the city, the radio station offered me a time slot with the generosity that comes with shared history. "Tell the story," they said. "We'll make room." I said I needed a smaller room and fewer watts. They looked hurt until I told them the truth. Some stories aren't built for broadcast. They're built for kitchens and community rooms with bad coffee and good chairs. For church basements where tape machines are explained by men whose hands learn precision. For hospital windows that remember bubbles. "What do we air?" the program director asked. "Air the quiet," I said. "Play a minute of nothing and tell people it's what relief sounds like." He thought I was kidding until the phones lit up during the test. People called from garages and grocery store parking lots to say thank you for the song with no notes that reminded them of mornings before anyone else woke up. One man said he hadn't heard that silence since his deployment ended, and he took the first shower in his own bathroom. A woman said it sounded like her mother's breathing after a long fever finally broke. The quiet got better ratings than my best monologue ever did. There's a lesson in there for men like me who mistake eloquence for service. The engineer returned the old reel with a soft cloth wrapped around it like a shawl. A sticky note on the canister read enough in someone else's hand. "Tape is like bone," he said. "It carries stress. You treat it rough. It tells you where it hurt by breaking there again." He showed me how to store it not as a relic to be worshipped, but as a document to be respected. Cool, dry, flat, unbothered. Play the copy when you must, he said. But even then, ask why. I asked myself the same about the shoes. The donation bin had emptied and refilled, but the little sneakers were gone in the best direction. A staffer told me they'd found feet the day after I dropped them off. Kid insisted, she said. Wouldn't take any other pair. I didn't need to see them on a sidewalk to feel the way that sentence changed jobs, from weight to wing. On the drive home, I rolled past a park where a child chased a bubble like an oath. The bubble rose, wobbled, and didn't pop. It didn't have meaning. It had buoyancy. Sometimes that's the whole sermon. The river asked for a goodbye of its own, so I walked the bank at dusk, rope in my bag, recorder left at home, like a dog that had done enough tricks for one life. The storm drain was painted with a fresh layer of teenagers' immortality, names, hearts, declarations. On the lip, someone had written in chalk, I lived there then, below, IT. I don't live there now. The rain would take it. That was the point. I touched the letters with 2 fingers the way you test a pie for heat. Warm, real, temporary, perfect. When I turned to go, I felt that old weight on my shoulder. Not a demand, not a command. A hand, the kind you don't shake off because it knows when to leave. You can let go. The air didn't say. You did. It didn't add. I walked back to the car, hearing only water and small lives doing their practicing cricket sawing. Distant breaks. A couple failing at an argument and winning at a life. At home the sink ran, unremarkable and generous. I ate an orange because I'm a cliché with good taste. The peel misted the air that once had carried other people's words to me. Now it carried citrus, which is an upgrade. The voicemail light blinked once like a heartbeat that had learned moderation. It was the woman whose voice had tuned so many men back to human. Neighborhood night tomorrow, she said. Oranges, bad coffee, good chairs, bring nothing. Bring yourself. Men like me like to bring rope and recorders. I brought neither. In the basement, folding chairs faced nothing in particular. The only hum was the lights. People told small stories with edges sanded down by truth. About lost dogs found 3 blocks over. About daughters who teach you to use your inside voice when you're angry at yourself. About a grandfather who learned tick-tock dances to keep his knees honest. When it was my turn, I said nothing about holes or culverts or reels. I told them about quiet. About how it sounded on a mountain that had practiced one sentence for too long and finally learned another. About how sometimes the bravest thing a place can do is stop talking. After, in the parking lot, she pressed a thurible into my hand again, then took it back. No, she grinned. You don't need a prop. We stood beneath cafe lights strung on a budget and talked about the ordinary. The way grief goes to the hardware store. The way relief learns your coffee order. The way forgiveness is sometimes just letting a door swing shut without checking it 5 times. Later, in my apartment with a good paper smell, I opened a drawer and looked at what remained of the old life. Extra batteries, a roll of gaffer tape, a stack of non-disclosure agreements no one reads, a small tangle of cables that could build or strangle a story. I left them there. I took out a single index card and wrote the sentence in my handwriting, the way a man might copy a prayer even if he isn't sure who he's talking to. I slid the card into the frame of the kitchen mirror where my reflection has been working out how to be less of a suspect and more of a neighbor. The card said, I lived there then. I don't live there now. On the way to bed, I paused at the faucet like an old superstition. It didn't tap. The relief wasn't ecstatic. It was responsible. A landlord who fixes things on time and never raises the rent out of spite. In the quiet came a single memory. A hand on my wrist on a ladder in a story I wasn't in. A voice that once begged a world to be softer. Hold on, it had said. Don't let go. I held on then. I let go now. Both were correct. I went back without rope, without recorder, without the crutches I'd mistaken for courage. Dusk made the foothills honest. Everything softens when the light does. The shack stood where it has always stood, weather-silvered and stubborn, no longer a stage, but a structure with a job small enough to be noble. The square in the floor was only a square. I stood on the threshold and listened to the kind of quiet that has temperature. It was warm, not because of weather, because of what had stopped. A car door thumped behind me. She walked up the path with the pace of someone who refuses to dramatize pain. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We stood shoulder to shoulder, not touching, sharing the sort of silence people usually buy in spas, but which the world sometimes gives for free if you earn it the long way. The drip kept time like a metronome you set to lullabies. The boards under our feet were just boards, not history trying to hold our ankles. She said the sentence once, not for the whole, not for me, for herself. I lived here then. I don't live here now. The words didn't echo. They landed, they stayed. There's a difference people don't talk about enough. An echo wants to be chased. A landing wants to be left in peace. We took the long way back to the turnout. She talked about the ordinary on purpose. A neighbor who grows tomatoes, mean as a landlord. A bad movie with a good dog. A pair of shoes she won't throw away because her feet remember joy in them. I told her about a teenager at a church basement who asked if ghosts can be physics and how the right answer is yes, if you treat them kindly. She laughed the kind of laugh that scuffs sorrow's knees and makes it sit down for a minute. The next afternoon, the station gave me air I didn't deserve, and I gave it back emptier than anyone expected. I started with a story that didn't sell itself. A mountain that learned a sentence and forgot it on purpose. A city that carried echoes down its veins. A room that taught a tape to breathe. Then I aired 1 minute of quiet. Nothing. Radios hummed in kitchen windows and truck cabs and waiting rooms. In my headphones, the silence had flavor. A hint of pine, a memory of oranges, the faintest ghost of a voice that had learned to rest. When the minute ended, I said only this. If you needed that, keep it. If you didn't, now you know what it sounds like when a place practices being done. The phone lines lit like a small town on the 4th of July. A man on his lunch break at a tire shop said the quiet made his ribs stop arguing. A grandmother in Aurora said it sounded like the moment after her granddaughter's fever broke and before the first laugh. A vet said it wasn't a miracle, but it did the job. Then a boy 12 maybe asked if he could play a sound through the phone. I said sure. He held his cell to a sink and turned the faucet. It ran, just ran. It used to tap, he said. Now it doesn't. Is that anything? I told him yes. It's everything. In the lobby, the program director hugged me with the cautious affection of a man who has learned to respect boundaries. We thought you were going to bring a monster, he said. You brought a room. We stood in the kind of awkward that means no one wants to ruin a good thing by naming it too fast. What now? He asked. Now nothing, I said. Let the quiet do its work until it clock outs on its own. At the community center, I found a small crowd and no poster. Word had drifted like pollen. We didn't set up microphones. We pushed the good chairs into a loose congregation and let people be neighbors. A young mother said she'd practiced the sentence in the grocery store when the old aisle got loud in her head. A retired nurse said she'd whispered it to the space beside her bed, where grief still woke at 3 a.m., because clocks remember. A man with paint on his hands said he'd chalked it on a storm drain off the river and then watched the rain. Take it like a blessing that knows when to leave. She came late, as busy people do, and sat on the back row like a student who already knew the material, but came to honor the teacher. When it was her turn, she didn't recount 1983. She talked about 2025, A morning where coffee tasted like mercy. A meeting where a hard word was a door, not a wall. A joke a child told her that landed like confetti. Found alive, she said, is not a headline from long ago. It's something I do every day on purpose. After we closed the room with nothing but goodbyes, a teenage girl waited by the door with a look that is half courage, half plea. She pulled a cheap recorder from her backpack, the kind with a plastic mic that makes everything sound like a confession. I went to the culvert last week, she said, apology and mischief braided together. I wanted the voice. It wasn't there. I thought I'd done it wrong. She pressed play. Water, air, her own breath. Then, barely, like a butterfly deciding whether to land. I lived there then, not from the pipe, from the girl, without meaning to. She startled at herself. It came out, she said. I didn't plan it. You don't have to go back, I told her. You brought it forward. She nodded, the way people nod when they feel a new sentence take root behind their teeth. She tucked the recorder away like a bird she wasn't going to cage. On her way out, she turned and asked, if it comes back, what do I do? I said, the same thing, not as defense. As grammar, my apartment felt bigger than it was. I did the thing I always do and checked the faucet. It ran. The index card on the mirror caught the evening light like a small flag no army would notice, and every neighbor would. I almost moved it, then left it. Some reminders are not for show. When sleep finally came, it brought a dream I'd earned. A ladder steady under my feet, a belt in my hand, a child's palm gripping, because that's what you do when a stranger says hold on, in a voice that sounds like the world narrowing to a single survivable point. In the dream, the hand found another hand, and my job was only to be a rung. That's what stories are when we get out of their way. Not cages. Not spotlights. Rungs. Dawn reached in like forgiveness. I poured coffee and cut an orange and stood in the kitchen not looking for signs. The city woke, and then I did the most radical thing a man in my line of work can do. I made no plan. I let the day come to me without asking it to justify itself. The watershed wanted a goodbye, the way a porch light wants moths, not for drama, for completion. I walked the river path at an hour when the city loosens its tie. The storm drain wore fresh chalk like a temporary tattoo. I lived there then. I don't live there now. Rain had softened the edges. Kindness does that. A kid sat cross-legged nearby with a skateboard helmet and the particular stillness children get when they're listening to something grown-ups can't hear. He glanced at me, then at the tunnel, then back at his own shoes as if consulting them. You waiting on it to talk? I asked. He shrugged without embarrassment. My brother says there used to be a voice. He says I missed it. He tapped his helmet with a knuckle. I hear other stuff, though. It's like when you say a word too many times, and it stops being a word. Then you say it again later, and it's new. He looked at the chalk. I said that sentence in math class when I got stuck. It made my head less loud. Does it work every time? I said. No, he grinned. But it works enough. We didn't test the pipe. We didn't perform for it. We let the water keep its consonants. The boy stood, brushed road dust off his knees, and asked if I knew where the mountain was. West, I said, which is accurate and also a metaphor. He nodded like he'd expected the answer, then kicked off on his board with the loose confidence of someone still willing to be bad at a thing in public. The tunnel breathed only air. I took that as a blessing. After sunset, the station gave me 5 minutes that could have been 50 if I'd asked. I didn't. I told the short version because some stories grow truer when you trim them close. A child once said I live here now into a hole that wasn't a mouth until it learned to be one. A city carried that sentence in its plumbing and its pipes and its people. A room taught the sentence how to change jobs. Found alive, I said, isn't a headline from long ago. It's something we practice. Then I gave the air back to the listeners and asked them to do one small thing with it. If there's a place in your life that keeps talking in a voice you don't want, I said, don't argue with it tonight. Give it a new line to practice. Say, out loud or not, I lived there then. I don't live there now. If it doesn't take the first time, that's not failure. That's rehearsal. The engineer who loves machines more than metaphors texted me a photo of the board. All channels quiet, meters calm, a caption that read, "This is the best sound." A program director, who'd once begged me for fireworks, sent a single word, "Thanks." Then he added another, like a man learning a new grammar, "Enough." In the days after, quiet didn't become the brand of the city, because cities don't do brands that gentle, but it found its pockets. A cashier at the hardware store kept an index card taped under the counter. A woman at the bus stop said the sentence into her scarf when the old hour tried to return. A plumber, God bless plumbers, told a customer without irony that sometimes pipes stop tapping when houses feel safe. The bird watcher sent a postcard with a sketch of a ladder that was mostly hands. I drove to the shack one last time, not because I had business there, but because goodbyes are a craft. Dusk turned the foothills into long thoughts. The door opened on hinges that had been taught manners. The square in the floor was so ordinary, it made me laugh. I stood where the planks remember boots and belts and bravery, and I said thank you like a man who understands gratitude should be particular. Not thanks for the horror. Thanks for the lessons after. Thanks for the room that learned not to be a moth. Thanks for the sentence that changed careers. On the way back, I stopped at the turnout and watched the interstate blur into a patient ribbon. Cars threaded the dark with their tiny suns. Beside me, someone eased in and cut their engine. Pike leaned on her hood and handed me a thermos without comment. We drank in the kind of silence you don't have to earn anymore. "Any news?" she asked finally. "Just quiet," I said. "That's news," she said, and we clinked cups like amateurs at peace. Home smelled like paper and orange peel, which is to say, possible. The index card on the mirror had curled a little at one corner, as objects do when they're busy living instead of being worshipped. I pressed it flat and left it crooked on purpose. The sink ran, then stopped, then didn't apologize. The fridge hummed. The building sighed in that content way old structures do when they know their people are inside and accounted for. In the dream that night, the ladder was there again, because some images choose you. But this time I wasn't on it. I was below, hands up, steadying the bottom while other hands did the dangerous work above. The voice at the top said, "Hold on." The voice below said, "You can let go now." The voice in the middle said, "I lived there then. I don't live there now." The three were not arguing. They were harmonizing. I woke with my jaw unclenched. Morning brought the small errands that make a life. Coffee, emails, laundry, and neighbor's package rescued from weather. On the walk back from the mailbox, a girl of 12 or 13, purple, streaks in her hair. Eyes like mischief learning restraint rode by on a bike too big for her and smiled with the relief of someone who finally cleared a curb that had toppled her all week. As she passed, she said to no one and everyone, "Found alive," like an announcement, not a boast. The words did not echo. They landed. At the kitchen table, I laid out the tools I used to think were my trade: rope, recorder, extra batteries, gaffer tape. Then I put them away, not as renunciation, but as housekeeping. I kept one thing on the table, an orange. The peel came off in one long ribbon. I hung it on the back of a chair to dry in a shape that looked, if you squinted, like a small road across a small map. By noon, the city had leaned into its chores. A truck beeped in reverse. A dog negotiated with a crow. Somewhere, a radio aired 1 minute of quiet on purpose, and nobody changed the station. I stood in my doorway with coffee and let the day present itself without audition. A neighbor waved. A boy practiced a sentence under his breath. It would make a classroom easier. A woman laughed the way a boundary laughs when it knows it will be honored. Found alive isn't a miracle in the past tense. It's a practice in the present. It's a room with windows where the air remembers how to be kind. It's a sentence you can keep in your pocket until your hand remembers it's there. Then say it once and maybe again. I lived there then. I don't live there now. And if a place ever asks you to hold on, you'll know how. And if it asks you to let go, you'll know that too. The rest is water doing what water does. The rest is a city breathing in a key you can sing. The rest is quiet, finally, in the right way.